in approximately 20 minutes time for a leg stretch, coffee, yoga, whatever you like. But today then we're going to go through hopefully at least 1.5 of the remaining 2 models. Does that sound all right? Work with me, MV3C.
Yes.
Thank you. So let's see here, and I'm going to just try to present as usual. So I'm not the most technical individual at school. You have to shout if you have any questions, because I won't be able to see the chat. I don't have 2 screens. But if everything is working right now, you should see me and hear me, and then you should see a slide saying ethics part 3.
It's working.
Nice, thank you. All right, everyone. Just a quick sort of recap on what we talked about last week. And I know that there might be a lot of terms, concepts that sound similar, familiar. Might be different words or different terms for the same things. Unfortunately, some might say, for example, when we talk about consequentialism, some others say konsekvensetik or potentially only utilitarianism, etc. The idea here is just to remind ourselves on some of the things that we are working with now. So when we talked about the descriptive ethics last week, we basically think of descriptive ethic as you can say that you are the outsider and basically analyzing what people think was right or is right. So for example, one thing where we can classify the field of descriptive ethics, we had this Code of Hammurabi, for example. Remember that? That we sort of analyze, okay, this is how that society worked. This was the right way to act in that particular time, etc. Normative ethics, and why I said prescriptive ethics now in brackets is that sometimes people say prescriptive ethics as well. But when we talk about normative ethics, we talk about the ideas, ethical models then on how people should act. So the first sort of model of normative ethics that we worked with was then consequentialism. However, within consequentialism, obviously, we have different layers. So we talked a little bit about ethical egoism, ethical altruism, ethical universalism. And often the ethical universalism is then called utilitarianism. So I understand that there is a lot of concepts here, and my SP students tend to call this concept bingo. A lot of things that seem quite similar. You say terms, families, umbrella terms, etc. So therefore, the plan is that on the next lesson and the week after that, you will get a good opportunity to sort of gather all this info, and we can use the lessons more like, you could say, like tutorials or practice rounds. Sometimes it's also people tend to use the word applied ethics, and I guess when we talk about applied ethics is when we put these normative theories into action, so to speak. And for the philosophers in the room, we also have to mention the meta-ethics. So remember from last week when we talked about absolutism and relativism, often those type of questions tend to have a meta dimension. So when we say something is objectively right or wrong, then we need to define, all right, what is right and wrong then. That's when we talk about meta-ethic. However, today then, what we're going to do, today the focus is going to be on non-consequential theories. So if last week the focus was on consequential theories, and more specifically then utilitarianism, today our focus is going to be towards virtue ethics, which will be the start of this lesson, and after virtue ethics we'll take a break. And then if we have time, we will definitely talk about Kantian deontology, and hopefully we can also start mentioning Rossian deontology, but we'll see how it goes today. And added to this, everyone, under material, you have support material for all these theories that I've posted on different PDFs, and hopefully you can navigate through there if you want to do some extra reading. A warning is that even this slide today might be packed with text, and I know for a fact that you can't sort of absorb too much text in one time. Therefore, I'm going to rush through some things, but still, it's your responsibility to review the material posted on Classroom. So some slides I might not necessarily skip, but I won't go in too much into detail. And speaking of that, what I call then the deontology versus consequentialism versus ethics, it's referring to one of these worksheets under Classroom where you can sort of hopefully use that as sort of a tool to classify it. All right, this is deontology, this is consequentialism. I don't think we'll have time for it today, but maybe as a good activity on or later on this week, we can look at some dilemmas where we can start working to apply these different theories. So basically today will be the last lecture then of the unit, and then we will have at least 3 sessions where we can practice and use it as tutorials, potentially, class tutorials. Does that sound all right, everyone? Good one. All right. So when we now starting to go into the field of non-consequential theories, I think it's also important to address the fact that when we talked about absolutism and relativism, we tend to classify those types of, you could say then, families or categories as ways of defining, okay, what's right and wrong, obviously. So the relativists, what does a relativist say? Could anyone help me out here? A relativist, what does he or she take into consideration when making decisions?
Everything.
Everything? Could we be more specific there? A relativist. Yes, so we have the cultural aspect. Anything else? Does a relativist see right and wrong from an objective point of view? Obviously, you already mentioned it here, Charlie, but generally speaking, when we talk about relativists and how they view the world, if you like, could we say that it's subjective, right? So it could be subjective on a group level, cultural level, potentially even on an individual level. So the relativist would probably say that, all right, we have to take the circumstances that we're faced with into consideration. An absolutist, on the other hand, what does he or she think? Yes. So the absolutist would then go, all right, we don't really care about these circumstances. We don't care about if this is a cultural thing. We don't care about that was another era or whatever. Some things are right and wrong. And now when we are looking into the non-consequential theories, you could say that they are more or less leaning towards the absolutist corner or the relativist corner. And here's where it gets tricky, because the consequentialist theories are often more leaning towards relativism. So basically, if we're interested in the outcome, we sort of adjust our actions relating to how to maximize that outcome, which means that right and wrong can be relative depending on the situation. So, for example, the rule and act utilitarianism, you could say, is more or less relative. So the act utilitarianism is a very relative way of looking at the world. However, rule utilitarianism is a little bit more towards the absolutist corner. And potentially this is where it could get tricky, because we then also think of absolutism and relativisms as models on how to deal with certain situations. But why I wanted to have this sort of heads up here is that we could then also argue that non-consequential theories could be absolute in a sense, because there are certain things that are right and wrong on how to act. Certain acts are right and wrong. However, there are non-consequential theories that could also be a little bit relativist. So when we start now, remember that in the back of your head, and I'm going to emphasize these things once again. But the idea here is that when we talk about non-consequential theories, and I say the consequences should not be considered, potentially that's a bad way of formulating it. But what I mean with it is that the non-consequentialists considered the act first. The act is right or wrong. Then the outcomes would come as a natural product of those actions. So the idea here is that non-consequentialist doesn't necessarily go around and thinking, all right, we don't care about the consequences at all. What I mean here is that the non-consequential theories have their starting point in the actual act rather than the consequence. And I will emphasize these things a little bit more later on. So we're going to start with the first non-consequential theory. And if anyone looks at På Spåret on Fridays, I'm asking you now, MV3C, by looking at this picture, where are we heading? 12 points.
Greece.
Ancient Greece. I like that.
Same.
Can we be more specific? Who do you think we have here in front of us? I don't expect you to know this by heart, but if we talk about ancient Greece, we have a few options, don't we? Who could it be without cheating and looking at the slide?
Aristotle.
Yes, of course. So the first then non-consequential theory or model, if we're going to use the model now as a word, is what we then call virtue ethics. And virtue ethics sometimes is called a dygdetik as well. Virtue ethics is obviously, as you pointed out, rooting back to the ancient Greece, the old Greeks. And here, obviously, we have a sculpture or a painting of Aristotle. And virtue ethics, then, why do we define that as non-consequential theory? Well, obviously, we could have a whole course about virtue ethics, and I'm just going to be on the top of the iceberg here. So those of you who have who know your Aristotle might think that I'm being too simplistic now, and that might be the case. But I'm going to try to simplify at least my understanding of how a virtue ethics individual would act when faced with dilemmas or value conflicts. According to Aristotle and his friend, the idea is that virtues, and we know what a virtue is, right? Character feature, potentially. According to Aristotle and his friends, basically the idea is that we, as human beings, rather than looking sort of to the outside world when making decisions, we should work on ourselves. And the idea here is that within virtue ethics, you should focus on you as an individual. If you are a good, virtuous individual, then you will make good choices. So the idea here is that rather than looking at the act itself isolated or the consequences isolated, you should focus on you and your character. So if you do good things and if you train to become a good person, then everything else would follow. And the idea of a good person does good deeds is sort of the center of this model. But not only is this something that you that you just get for free, if you'd like. We have it in ourselves, according to this theory, that everyone has the potential of being good and acting in a good way. But the idea here is that you have to work on your character. You have to always have this sort of it's your own journey. Let's say that it's your journey to becoming more virtuous, but you have to do this through training. Personally, and I'm not gonna point out too much critique against this model, but I do think that virtue ethics might be a little bit outdated in a sense, and it might be hard to use as a guideline when you are faced with a tricky situation or when you are faced with a moral dilemma that you need to solve. I don't think anyone in either NV3C or me myself goes around on a day-to-day basis to think, oh, now I'm being virtuous. But I do think that the idea here kind of makes sense anyway, that if you do good things, if you become a good person, then obviously your surroundings and the situations you will face then will obviously then be basically, if you are good, then good things will happen. I think that's my understanding of virtue ethics. But what does it mean then? Well, what is a virtue? And I think here is potentially the tricky side to it. Because if we're going back to the old Greeks, maybe by being virtuous at that particular time was something that we don't see as potentially virtuous today. I think that virtues in the 21st century might differ quite a lot. And I don't either think it's the idea here that we should sort of apply old Greek interpretations of virtues on our day-to-day life. But the idea here is, again, if you are doing good things, then good things will follow. But according to the more sort of traditional way of looking at virtues, it is a character features, and you should use these virtues as a compass when you navigate and you are faced with new situations. And there's no Swedish word for this, but I always tend to think of the word lagom, that you shouldn't be too extravagant, you shouldn't be too stingy, you should be somewhere in between. You should always act in a balanced way. So you should never go to the extremes, so to speak, when you are making decisions. Because being virtuous is being balanced to some extent. Does this make sense? What I'm trying to point out here?
Yes, yes. Sure.
Go on. The virtues, I don't know, but I just pointed this out so hopefully we can get a sense of what I mean with this sort of the middle ground or the balanced way. I mean, in this case, rather than being rash or being a coward, you should be brave. And here's potentially where I think that virtue ethic might be hard to apply. Because what does brave mean then? Is brave, I don't know, standing up for someone, or is brave riding out into battle with a sword? I don't know. But you get what I mean. What does brave then mean? It's very contextualized. Brave in 100 years ago might be different to brave nowadays. Brave in Stockholm might be different to brave in Arvidsjaur, etc. Extravagant, stingy, generous. Sometimes we'd like to have those extravagant friends in our life, don't we? Sometimes we think that an extravagant thing to do might be positive. But the idea here is that extravagant is potentially not a virtue. So I think the key when it comes to virtue ethics, the idea here, obviously, as I said, we're only at the tip of the iceberg. There's obviously more to it, and you have some support reading on this as well. But at least my understanding is that if, again, and I'm emphasizing on this again, the idea is rather than looking to the outside, looking at consequences or looking at actions, you should look at within yourself. All right, that's the idea. That everyone has this inner potential, but you need to sort of nurture it, and you do that through training. Some of these arguments I've already sort of pointed out now when I was ranting about. And again, everyone, I'm not saying that virtue ethics is bad. This is just what I find potentially a little bit tricky, because it doesn't really tell us on how we should act. We could always say, all right, act in a virtuous way, but what does that mean then? Consequentialism, and eventually, now when we're looking into deontology, gives us more clear guidelines on how to act. Okay, consequences, or is the action right or wrong? Virtue ethics potentially in the middle ground, doesn't say too much on how we should actually deal with certain situations. And potentially a little bit optimistic. Do we really do that in our day-to-day lives? Go around and think, all right, how should I deal with this tricky situation? Oh, potentially I should be virtuous. I don't know. But the idea, again, into yourself, work on your character. If your character is good and it's become good through training, then good things will follow. Good decisions will follow. All right. Take a 5-minute leg stretch. Does that sound all right?
Yes.
Good one.
Yes.
Hello, I'm gonna go now. So
Yeah.
have a nice day.
Have a nice day. All right. Are we ready?
Yes.
Good one. So then, a quick reminder, inconsequential theories, what's the first thing that strikes you? How does a consequentialist think? If I were to throw this at you,
that the action depends on the consequence.
Mhm.
Or basically that if you you have to take into consideration, for example, like the history before the action, or what happened before the action.
Mhm.
The situation.
Okay, yes. Was that you, Da?
Yes.
Yes. And I saw someone writing something in the chat that I can't see, but I can hear.
And we can also say that, well, a consequentialist considers the consequence of an action. That the action is relative to whether the consequence is good. So does this help someone? Well, if yes, then the action was good. So they deem the action to be good or bad in terms of what the consequence is. So relative to.
Yes. So a consequentialist in general, the first thing that a consequentialist would take into consideration is, all right, what's the consequences of this action, right? And then you sort of assess whether the action is good or bad. But then there's layers here as well. So an ethical egoist, how does an ethical egoist think?
Is it good for me?
Is it good for me? Yes. So basically, the only thing, not the only thing, but what matters is whether or not the consequences of what is about to happen benefits me as an individual. Then the action could be good or bad. An ethical altruist or a particularist, what's the focus of that individual when faced with a situation?
Is it good for them
For them,
or the other person or whatever? The target is not themselves.
the target is not you yourself, the target is the group, right?
Yeah.
Yes. And then we have the universalists or utilitarianists. How do they think? For everyone. And do we have a way of measuring this?
Good for the most people. Or the more it's like the more people that benefited, the better the action, I think.
Exactly. So we had this formula, right? So we had value theory plus theory of the right action. And what is value according to a utilitarianist?
Happiness.
To maximize happiness, right? And to avoid
Pain
or suffering. Yes. So then the theory of right action is
to minimize pain
and
and improve happiness.
yes, for the
majority, for everyone.
Yes. Grazie mille. But then when we talk about virtue ethics, then what's the key in virtue ethics?
That there's sort of a definition of what is good and bad, which is not relative to whether, for example, like culture considers this action to be something that falls into our norms. Yes, it might fall into your norms, but that does not specifically mean that it is good.
So can we add on to that? Virtue ethics considers you as an individual to work on, right? That you work on your character. And if you are a good person, you will do
good deeds.
Yes, so you will do good things, but the focus point is that you have a potential as an individual, and that potential could be trained. And if you train that enough through virtuous training, you will do good things. Yes, good one. And now, my friends, the last category, deontology. I assume that a lot of you at least have heard about Immanuel Kant. And we're gonna, at least, I don't think we'll have time for Ross today, unfortunately. So we're just gonna repeat what we call Kantian deontology. Sometimes deontology is also called duty ethics or pliktetik. And what can we infer from this then? Well, obviously, we are talking about actions, or we have certain duties. We have certain duties to follow or to act upon. But before we go into that, and this is what I mentioned in the start here, there are divisions here as well. So you have what we call absolutist deontology and relativist deontology. So here's where it might get a little bit tricky. So I'm asking you, please follow. And if you have questions, just interrupt me, okay? But I think the general idea behind the deontology could be explained something like this. Some kinds of actions are wrong or right in themselves, regardless of the consequences. So the idea is that we have certain duties, we have certain things that we should act upon. Certain actions are good or bad. And here we can sort of see that we have this absolutist way of thinking, right? So we can say that, all right, doesn't really matter what happens after the action, so to speak. When we've done it, the consequences doesn't really matter because we focus on the actions themselves. But then there are these, you could say, two schools of deontology. And often we think of deontology, or it's at least been presented through sort of this Immanuel Kantian way of looking at it. Because you could say that Immanuel Kant is basically the poster boy of deontology. That's also why I brought in Ross to this, to make it a little bit more nuanced. Because often we think about, okay, so if some things are right and wrong, we are going towards the absolutist corner, right? But actually, we could say that some actions could be relative as well, and we are defining that something called pro tanto duties, and that's where Ross comes into the picture. But we're gonna start with Immanuel Kant. And if you're taking notes now, and I know for a fact that this, again, as I said, concept bingo, universalism, absolutism, utilitarianism, there's a lot of words and terms that sound similar. And obviously we could have simplified it a bit. However, you guys are third years, so I'm going to give you the proper definitions. So we don't, not in kindergarten. Therefore, I'm calling it by its name. But if you're taking notes now, or at least write yourselves a little reminder, when we talk about deontological universalism, this is potentially then the category in which Immanuel Kant could be placed. And it's a more absolute way of looking at actions. So the idea here is that the rules apply to everyone, or the duties, under all circumstances. So a very absolutist way of thinking. And this is one example, and obviously this is not Immanuel Kant who came up with this example. I don't think he had an idea on whether or not to eat beef, but I think the example is, the logic here is Immanuel Kantian way of looking at it. So for example, let's say then that you are a Hindu, and for religious or cultural reasons, you believe that it's wrong to eat beef. This rule then, that it's always wrong to eat beef, would be a part of your deontology if you were a deontological universalist. Because then you will think that it would be wrong for anyone to eat beef. Doesn't matter if you are, this individual are Hindus or not. It's always wrong, because the idea is that eating beef is always wrong. Then that will be your rule, that will be your duty to act upon. Thou shalt not eat beef. The deontological relativist, though, still agrees on the fact that some actions are right or wrong. But where the relativism comes in here is that it's sort of based on the circumstances, based on the context. So a deontological relativist would probably approach this situation or dilemma like this, that you as an individual, you might feel it's wrong to eat beef because you are a Hindu then, hypothetically. But you will also then consider, but it could be okay for people that are not Hindus to eat beef. That doesn't mean that you don't think that it's wrong to eat beef. It just means that the rules doesn't necessarily apply to everyone. Do we see the difference there? Good one. These are two of the slides that I'm then gonna let you review yourself, because obviously we have a religious and secular layer to the deontology here as well, but the logic is the same. So you can just review that yourselves, or if you have questions on this, you can take it with me on Friday or next week. But I think, and again, as I said, packed slides. The reason for that is just to sort of get it in your heads, okay? So, but the idea, the duty-based deontological way of thinking is basically that you should do the right thing. You should do it because it's the right thing to do. Don't do wrong things and avoid them because they're wrong. So it's a very straightforward way of looking at how to deal in situations. The problem then occurs, obviously, that, okay, what is right and wrong? What is the right act? Someone needs to have come up with these things, right? And I think here is also where deontological ethics are faced with critique. The same type of critique that I had on, let's say then, consequentialism, where it could be a little bit brutal sometimes, that you have to make decisions that you might feel maybe doesn't feel that good to do this, but still the consequences are good. We talk about virtue ethics, all right, how should we really act in a virtuous way? And I think the critique here towards deontological ethics is then, all right, who then decides what is right and wrong? And given that backdrop, I think we should go into this fellow, who would potentially then be, as I said before, the poster boy of deontological ethics. So here we have Immanuel Kant, and I assume that even those of you who haven't had philosophy have maybe heard about him at least. Kant, Immanuel Kant. Not really? Okay. And I mean, why are we then working with Kant? Well, you could say that he is the one who is sort of representing this deontological universalism. He claimed that there are certain things that are sort of instringently right and wrong. But we need to know a little bit about Kant as an individual before we're going to look into his idea on what's right and wrong. Because he was brought up in the city of Königsberg, so I think that was Prussia at the time. I think today Königsberg is located in Poland. Correct me if I'm wrong. Do we have any experts on geography? I think Königsberg is now called, is it Danzig maybe? Whatever. He was brought up in Prussia, at least. And even though that we could argue that Kant is not necessarily in his ethics, like his Christian background isn't that relevant, I'd say, but we still need to take it into consideration when we're thinking about, all right, where does all these rules come from then? Immanuel Kant would probably say that, well, it doesn't matter if I'm a Christian here or not, but we have to understand that he was brought up into a tradition and a society deeply influenced by Christianity. But Immanuel Kant, basically, the legend goes that he lived his whole life here in Königsberg, and he had the same routines every day. So he went to the square, had a coffee, went into some arguments with other people at that square, and then went back to his office. That was basically his life. So he was a little bit of a special character, which is quite interesting. Then, since hundreds of years afterwards, we are still having lectures about how to act according to this man. But I think it's important that we address these things. What Immanuel Kant basically came up with, that he said that there are certain rules, there are certain duties that we have as individuals, and these duties are absolute, exceptionless. There are certain rules that we should always follow. And I mean, when we are looking at these rules, we often come back to these sort of classic standard ones that we are potentially brought up into. The idea of it's bad to steal, it's bad to kill, it's bad to, I don't know, go into arguments with your parents, I don't know. So obviously these sort of ideas have been quite rooted in our society, whether we like it or not. And here's potentially also the argument saying that, okay, here we can see this religious or the evidence of religious thinking. It doesn't have to be Christian necessarily, it could be any other religion as well. But the idea here, according to Kant, is that if we're unsecure on how to act, we should always refer to our kategoriska imperativ, the categorical imperative. And one of the quotes here that I think describes the categorical imperative, according to Kant, is the idea of live your life as though your every act would become a universal law. And if we follow those inner duties that we have, the society would be good. We will live in an ethically good way. Our moral would be good. For those of you who read philosophy, would you agree with my understanding of the categorical imperative? Would you have any other ideas on this? I know some of you read philosophy, right? I know for a fact. Melissa, are you around? You talked about philosophy courses.
Yeah, I'm just writing, that's why.
Yeah, right. But would you sort of agree with the idea of the categorical imperative? That you should sort of act as everything, as your act would become the norm, so to speak.
Yeah. I agree.
You agree? Good one. But okay, everyone, for those of you who are not into your Immanuel Kant and dream about his ideas every day, I think the easiest way to think about the categorical imperative is basically the idea of we don't really need to sort of explain these set of rules explicitly, because according to Kant, we have that in ourselves to an extent. So if I don't want people going around stealing, then I should not steal. If I don't want random people to go around kill each other, then obviously I shouldn't go around kill people. If I don't want people to come late to class, I should not come late to class myself. If I don't want students or friends or family to act in a rude way towards me, I should not act in a rude way towards you or to my family members or to my friends. So it's logically it makes sense, right? The problem here is that, all right, but who then decides those things? Who decides what is right and wrong? Well, then we have this meta question again. And I think that we are affected by the way we've been brought up. And sometimes we might consider certain things differently. I still think that generally speaking, we will agree on some key things, such as maybe then killing or stealing, etc. That's generally bad things. But then obviously there's gray zones as well. And here's potentially where the relativist critique comes in. And here we have it again. As I said, use the slides as study material as well. So you should sort of aim then towards that all the actions that you do, your acts, that you should always think that, all right, do I want everyone else? But should it become a sort of a general law that everyone else would do the same thing? Then you're acting in a good way. All right. We have another 2 minutes. No, 10 minutes. I do think that there's some things, again, with Immanuel Kant that we could address from sort of a critical standpoint. And there are these situations where Immanuel Kantian deontology could be up for criticism. And the Besserwisser point here is just me trying to be funny. I don't know if you think it's funny, but the idea of someone is telling us that we have certain duties, but then we need, what are those duties? And then you have this fellow saying, well, you should look at the categorical imperative. Might be a weak, I don't know, debate technique. I know that there's some debatists in the room, but we obviously have some clear situations here where you have the murder versus self-defense situation. How should we deal with that according to Kant, etc.? I remember in English 5, you probably don't remember it, but I'm an old elephant, and I know that I showed you a clip from Inglourious Bastards in English 5. Do you remember that? The opening scene of Inglourious Bastards, where you have this, he's like a Nazi, he's like a Nazi lieutenant who basically breaks into the room or to the house of this French family. Have anyone seen that? Or does anyone remember? You don't remember? It's a good film, by the way. But here we have that classic situation where dilemmas where Kantian theory might be very tricky to sort of act upon is that, let's say then that you had a friend who was let's say that you have a friend who for some reason feared for his or her life, and then all of a sudden you hide them in your house, and then the people who are after this individual comes and knock on your door and they ask, is this individual in here? Well, obviously you would probably say, up, no, he or she is not here, right? That would be our natural instinct, wouldn't it? I hope.
Yes.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. But according, I mean, strictly theoretically, you'd say that, well, from a Kantian point of view, well, you don't want people to go around lying, do you? So then obviously you lying in order to protect your friend. You could argue that, well, according to Kant, that's a bad way of acting. However, a majority of people would probably lie, these white lies or whatever you call it. And here's where Ross then presents an alternative to Kant's deontology. So he talks about pro tanto duties. So we have some exceptions to these rules. We should not lie generally, according to Ross. But in relation to his critique against Kant is that when we are faced with these type of situations, we need to at least sometimes stray away from the general duties that Kant presents that we actually have. But I think it would be a system overload for me to go through all of that today as well. But I think what I want you to make sure that you review here, get yourself a good understanding of what does Kant mean with the categorical imperative. What is that? How can we apply that to situations? And also think about virtue ethics here then, and try to contrast these three things. So what's the pros and cons with, let's say, each model? And then, is it Friday? I always forget, is it Friday or Thursday? It's Friday, right? Yeah. On Friday, we go through Ross, and then we spend the other leg of the lesson starting to working with this model on actual dilemmas, where we can actually try to, all right, this is how we would act. Does that sound all right? So I remain behind for another 5. If anyone have any questions or anyone need any clarifications in relation to what we have or what I have talked about today, I'll remain behind. But let's pledge then that on Friday we look into Ross, who presents an alternative to Kant, and we then looking into some dilemmas where we start to apply consequentialism, virtue ethics, and deontology or actual cases, because basically that's what we're going to do then when we come back live in school.
Okay.
All right. Have a good day, everyone.
You too.
And those of you who haven't handed in the Barker thing, you have this week. Yes.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.